A knock on the garden gate. It was a lovely and calm morning in St. Mary's. The sun filtered softly through the branches of the old elm tree by the fence, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of gold. Birds flitted between hedges, and the faint scent of honeysuckle lingered in the air. Miss Marple, wearing her faded gardening hat and a pair of worn gloves, was in her back garden carefully watering her delphiniums. Her hands moved with precision and care as if each petal mattered. Beside the border of rose bushes her maid Winifred was tugged. Winifred looked up from the ground and tilted her head. "Is something wrong, Miss Marple? You seem a little preoccupied this morning." Miss Marple paused, looking up from a cluster of pale yellow daisies. There was a slight crease between her brows, and the corners of her mouth were drawn in. "It's Raymond," she said after a moment. "His birthday is next week, and I haven't the faintest idea what to gift him." Winifred smiled softly. "Now, what kind of things does Mr. Raymond like?" Miss Marple gave a small nostalgic chuckle. When he was a boy, it was always cars, jeeps, and all manner of noisy little toys. He had a passion for engines, and even built a small wind-up model of a lorry once entirely from tin and string, but that was years ago now, she sighed. He's grown rather fond of travelling to foreign lands. Rail journeys, river boats, all very exciting, I imagine. Winifred stood and brushed the soil from her knees. "Why don't you give him a diary, a proper leather-bound one, the kind you can take on trips? He could jot down places he visits, things he sees." Miss Marple looked up, her expression brightening. "A diary? Yes, of course, that's an excellent idea." Winifred was realistic, sensible, and fully Raymond. "Yes, I will give him a notebook this year, as if on cue, to disrupt the tranquil family atmosphere." A strong knock came from the front gate. Winifred stared at the sound and wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll go, shall I?" "Do, please," Miss Marple said, carefully placing the watering container near the flower bed. Winifred made her way around to the front of the cottage. Through the picket fence stood a skinny, slightly nervous-looking young guy, perhaps in his early 20s. His clothes were rumpled, and he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Yes?" Winifred questioned, peeping through the gate. "I'd like to see Miss Marple, please," the child responded, his voice firm yet hesitant. Winifred opened the gate halfway and looked at him with mistrust. "And you are," Walter continued, "George's son. We live just down the lane, and my father runs the laundry." Winifred hesitated for a time before turning back into the garden. Miss Marple emerged from behind the climbing clematis, her hands still gloved. A light frown on her face, she approached the gate with calm curiosity. "Walter, is it?" she said, eyeing the boy closely. "Ah, yes, you're the one who used to steal sweets from the tuck shop at school, weren't you? And didn't your father throw you out for stealing his watch?" Walter shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, ma'am, that was me." Miss Marple slowly removed her gloves, her gaze sharp beneath the softness of her tone. "I hear you've not exactly turned over a new leaf, are you?" Walter flushed. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "but that's not why I came. I need your help." She raised her brows. Walter looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to be eavesdropping on the guest house. "The one just outside the village, near the old wood. I went there the other night to steal something." I assumed as Miss Marple didn't react immediately. She stood very still, absorbing every word. "I panicked," Walter went on. "I didn't touch anything, I swear, but I must have left my footprints in the blood. I just ran, but if someone finds the body and those prints, they'll think I did it. I didn't, Miss Marple. I didn't kill her." His voice cracked. "Please help me. I'll never steal again. I mean it. Just please." For a long moment the garden was silent. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes re well. she remarked, taking off her gardening hat. You've certainly gotten yourself into a mess, but I suppose it's fortunate you came to me rather than hiding in a hedge. You'll help me. I will check into it, she said briskly, but don't mistake this for absolution. You have a lot to prove. Walter, yes, Miss Marple. I understand. She turned back towards the garden path, already lost in thought. Now tell me exactly what time this happened and what you saw before you ran. Every detail. We must start somewhere after. All and so began quietly, and without fanfare, another of Miss Marple's inquiries. One sparked not by a letter or village rumour, but by a boy with blood on his boots, and a conscience finally stirring to life. Chapter 2. A Visit to the Station. Miss Marple turned to Walter with a quiet resolution. The first thing we must do, she stated firmly, is go straight to the police station. Walter, pale and visibly anxious, nodded. The walk to the station was brisk but tense. Miss Marple didn't speak, and Walter seemed too absorbed in his own worry to attempt conversation. The streets of St. Mary Me, usually so inviting and cheerful in the middle of the morning light, felt oddly silent. Even the birdsong seemed distant. When they arrived at the station, the constable on duty gave Miss Marple a respectful nod and showed her through to the main office, where Inspector Albert sat. Walter shrank back slightly, but Miss Marple held up a hand calmly. Inspector Albert, if I may, she said, her voice composed but insistent. I've brought Walter here because I believe he's found himself in something far more serious than any of his usual mischief. The inspector folded his arms. Go on, Miss Marple. She recounted the story with characteristic clarity. She explained how Walter had come to her garden in a state of distress, how he had admitted to attempting a theft at the guest house on the edge of the village, and how instead of valuables he had stumbled across a gruesome scene, a woman's lifeless body surrounded by blood. Inspector Albert listened without interrupting, but the crease between his brows increased as the story progressed. When Miss Marple finished, he turned his gaze on Walter. And you expect me to believe this? I do, Miss Marple simply stated. Walter has made mistakes, no one doubts that. But I believe him when he claims he didn't commit this crime. He came to me for help, which at least ought to earn him a hearing. The inspector was silent for a long time before giving a slow nod. Miss Marple, if it were anyone else speaking, I'd have dismissed it outright. But given your record, I'll give him a little time. That doesn't mean he escapes justice for his past. He'll still have to answer for that. Agreed, Miss Marple said. Now, before we go tearing through that guest house, I believe we should speak to its owner. His name is Alcester, and I'd prefer he be present during any investigation. Inspector Albert gave a short nod to the constable. Bring in Alcester. He's the one who lets the guest house near the wood. Tell him it's urgent. Alcester arrived at the station about a half-hour later, puzzled and slightly out of breath. He was a tall man with thinning hair, a sun-worn face, and the habit of rubbing his hands together when nervous. What's this all about? He asked as he stepped into the room. Why have I been called here? Inspector Albert motioned to Walter. This young man broke into your guest house, Alcester, and he says he found a woman's body there. We intend to investigate immediately. Do you have the keys to the property? Alcester appeared surprised, lifting a lifeless body. No one's mentioned anything to me. He dug in his coat pocket and produced a set of keys. Sure, I have them, but that place has been let for the past several months, and I don't go there until there's maintenance or a changeover. To whom was it let? The inspector inquired, taking the keys from him. A man named Charles Alcester responded. He moved in with his wife and little daughter about 2 or 3 months. A quiet fellow, paid on time, never any complaints, and where is he now? And a shadow crossed Alistair's face. He passed away just last week. Road accident, tragic business. Now it's just the wife and child staying there. They're supposed to move out at the end of the month. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes ever so slightly. And the wife, what do you know of her? Not much, said Alistair. She kept to herself, friendly enough, but not the sort to gossip or wander the village. Name's Margaret. I think they're daughters, around 5 or 6. Inspector Albert smiled at Miss Marple, who was already pulling on her gloves, and added, "We have a guest house to visit, indeed." Miss Marple agreed that if there is a body, we must discover it, and if Walter is telling the truth, that unfortunate woman deserves much more than to be left behind in quiet. As they prepared to depart the station, Walter lingered near the doorway, watching the proceedings unfold with an odd mix of guilt and hope. For the first time in a long time, someone believed him. Not just anyone, but Miss Marple herself. Outside, the clouds were beginning to gather in. The sky, the village rooftops stood quiet under the weight of something that hadn't quite happened yet. A storm was coming, not of wind or rain, but of truth-buried secrets and justice waiting in the shadows of a guest house. Chapter 3. The silence in the cupboard. The sky above St. Mary Me had begun to become cloudy, with soft clouds accumulating as Miss Marple, Inspector Albert, Walter, and Alistair approached the ivy-covered guest house on the village's outskirts. The house, once a cheerful country retreat, now stood solemn and still, its windows like unblinking eyes and its stone steps slightly weathered as if they, too, had been holding their breath. Miss Marple paused by the gate, peering up at the second floor. "You're quite sure it was near the stairs?" she asked, her voice steady but gentle. Walter nodded, pointing to the thin timbered structure leading up from the corridor. "Yes, right. By the first floor landing. I tripped in the dark and landed next to her." Inspector Albert motioned for 2 officers to take the lead, and the front door creaked as it opened, displaying the usual mustiness of an underused country home. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, disturbed only by their movements. The wooden floor creaked faintly beneath their feet. They climbed the staircase with caution each step, bringing a sharper edge of anticipation near the landing. The group came to a sudden stop. There she was. The woman lay twisted at the base of the stairs, her head resting against the wall, one arm bent unnaturally across her chest. Her dress, cream with a faded blue floral print, was deeply stained with blood. Alistair walked closer, his face pallid. "That's her," he murmured quietly. Charles' wife, Mary, Miss Marple, knelt beside the body with a careful grace that defied her age. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. Scattered across the floor near the woman's outstretched hand were several pieces of paper, creased and slightly torn. She reached for one and turned it over. Children's drawings, scribbled in crayon, purple suns, stick figures with outstretched arms, a large house with smoke curling from the chimney. These belonged to the little girl, she murmured, holding the sheet delicately. Inspector Albert's jaw tightened. "We searched every room, top to bottom, no exceptions," while the inspector delivered instructions to his subordinates. Miss Marple quietly gathered the crumpled drawings and tucked them into her handbag. She rose to her feet and headed upstairs, alone. Her footsteps, as silent as they were deliberate. The corridor above was narrow, its floorboards warped slightly with age. Rooms opened off both sides, their doors slightly ajar, as if hesitant to reveal their secrets. She moved carefully, glancing into each space, bedroom, study, box room, until she reached the last door at the end of the hall. Inside, toys scattered on the floor included a wooden duck with wheels, a teddy bear missing an eye, and a tea set with a damaged saucer. The feeling of desertion was tangible, and something about the silence disturbed even Miss Marple. She scanned the room slowly, then stepped toward the wardrobe. Her hand hesitated for just a moment on the handle before pulling it open inside. Nestled against the far corner was the girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, her tiny knees tucked to her chest and her arms wrapped tightly around them. Her blonde hair hung across her face, and her large, fearful eyes stared at Miss Marple without blinking. She didn't move or flinch, merely breathed quickly and shallowly, making her entire frame quiver. Miss Marple squatted down and dropped her voice to a near whisper. "My dear, it's perfectly all right. You're secure now." The girl said nothing. "I'm Miss Marple. We're here to help." Still no reaction. Miss Marple cautiously reached into her handbag and brought out one of the drawings, gently holding it up. "Is this yours?" she questioned in a pleasant and soothing tone. "It's rather good. A very happy son you've drawn." The girl did not nod or reach for the image, remaining immobile. Her lips parted slightly, and her eyes glassy. Miss Marple took a deep breath. "She's either too scared or unable to speak," she whispered primarily to herself. "This isn't the time to press her." Just then, Inspector Albert walked into the room, his eyes widening as he saw the youngster. "Good heavens, she's here. She's unharmed but in shock," Miss Marple remarked slowly. "We'll need a doctor and someone experienced with children for now. She needs calm and no questions." Albert nodded seriously. "We'll arrange it." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room once more as he left to make the necessary calls. On a small table by the bed lay a stack of documents half concealed beneath a storybook. She lifted them carefully among them and found a marriage certificate issued by the village church. The handwriting was faded but clear, so the woman was definitely Mary. She slipped the certificate into her handbag as well and returned. Alistair was astonished. "Good heavens, is she?" She's upset but undamaged. Do you recognize her?" "Yes," he answered gently. "That's Charles's daughter. I remember when they moved here. She was always a quiet little creature." Miss Marple gazed at him attentively. "A home address, perhaps?" "Well, I always do," he said. "I wrote down his previous address, just in case. May I have it?" Alistair nodded, and got it from his wallet, a folded sheet of paper with ragged corners. Miss Marple read the address and passed it to Inspector Albert. "We must visit this place," she said. "There may be something there that explains this tragedy." Albert immediately agreed. "We'll leave now, Constable. Have the deceased taken to the hospital for post-mortem and take Walter back to the station for additional questioning." Alistair hesitated. "I should stay here and start cleaning up this place as a mess." Miss Marple's voice tightened slightly. "No, Mr. Alistair, you won't touch a thing. This house may yet contain critical evidence, and nothing should be damaged." Albert gave a single nod. "This property is now under police custody until further notice. No one enters or exits without permission." The gathering reassembled outside once more, the afternoon sun now subdued by a canopy of grey clouds. The weight of what they had uncovered clung to them as they climbed into the police vehicle behind them. The guest house stood quiet again, its secrets half revealed, its shadows stretching across the garden path like a silent witness. But Miss Marple, with her eyes focused ahead, already knew the path forward was narrowing. She didn't yet have the whole picture, but pieces were beginning to form, and something in her quiet, thoughtful expression said that the mystery wouldn't remain. Chapter 4. The Woman. No one knew the travel to Charles Wem's former property was a peaceful one. Miss Marple sat in the rear of the police van, the small girl curled next her, gripping firmly to a corner of Miss Marple's shawl. The child had not spoken a single word, yet she hadn't resisted either. There was something trustworthy, about the way she followed. Miss Marple was fragile and solemn, and Inspector Albert, seated in the front, occasionally glanced back through the mirror, his expression thoughtful. "We're in deep waters now," he muttered, "and too many people claiming to know nothing." The house itself was a modest stone structure at the edge of the village, with roses blooming unevenly along the fence and curtains drawn in every window. It had the air of a place that was lived in but not openly shared. "They were greeted at yes?" she inquired warily. "Miss Marple and Inspector Albert to see the family." Albert responded graciously, producing his badge. The woman stepped back. "Come in." Inside the house had a warm but worn quality to it, floral wallpaper, slightly faded wooden furniture, scuffed with use within minutes. Miss Marple had invited everyone into the sitting room. There were 5 of them. Annie, Charles' elderly mother, has a rigid stance and a guarded stare. Lucas, his younger brother, is a hefty man with a square jaw and a cautious attitude. Dorothy, Lucas's quiet wife, clutched a tea towel with nervous hands. Amelia, their teenage daughter, stood at the door, awkward and uncertain. And Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, the little girl holding her hand. "I understand Charles died in a road accident recently, a terrible loss, and I offer my condolences." The room mumbled thanks. The atmosphere was already tense, but I must share something more. Miss Marple added earlier today that a woman's body was discovered at the guest house where Charles had been staying. She was found near the stairs, dead. The family reacted immediately. "That's impossible," Lucas cried. "Charles's wife Lily is right here." Miss Marple glanced to Lily and nodded. "Yes, she is." "This raises a serious question. If Lily is here, then who was the woman living with Charles at the guest house?" Nobody talked for a time. "We don't know," Lucas said finally. "We had no idea he was living with anyone else, Inspector." Albert's voice was forceful. "Obviously someone must have known your family. There were things Charles didn't tell us." Annie said stiffly, "He became more distant these last few years." Miss Marple opened her handbag and carefully removed the folded marriage certificate. The woman's name was Mary, and she wasn't a stranger, she was his wife. Gasps and uneasy shuffles followed as Miss Marple held out the document. "I found this during my search of the guest house. It is a legal marriage certificate. Charles Wentham and Mary Denning married at the parish church 7 years ago." A heavy silence fell before Dorothy spoke, her voice thin. "He never mentioned her once." Lucas shook his head. None of us had a clue, but Lily, who had remained silent until now, stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the little girl's face. "I knew," she said, her voice calm but heavy. "He told me." Everyone turned to look at her. Even Amelia, who was usually aloof, looked startled. "You knew about Mary?" asked Annie incredulously. "Yes, Lily said we couldn't have children. It was something Charles wanted more than anything. 7 years ago, he told me he was going to marry another woman, and I agreed to stay silent because I thought it would bring him peace." Miss Marple studied her face carefully, but recently he changed his mind. Lily nodded yes. "Right before the accident, he came to me, conflicted, upset. He told me he was intending to leave Mary." "Why?" Inspector Albert inquired. "Because she was having an affair." Lily responded with Alistair, the man who owns the guest house. The name struck the room like a dropped stone in still water. "My husband found out," Lily continued. "They'd been meeting in secret. There were arguments. He confronted Alistair twice, nearly came to blows. He told me everything, but asked me not to say a word." Miss Marple's brow wrinkled slightly. "Why did he decide to move into the guest house?" "I believe he wanted to see things for himself." Lily said he never confirmed it, but I knew he was watching them and waiting. Miss Marple and Inspector Albert shared a glance. "If what you say is true," the inspector replied then, "Alcester has motive and opportunity, and probably the youngster witnessed more than she's able already to disclose." Miss Marple added softly, looking down at the little girl who now sat curled on the edge of a chair, her drawing clutched to her chest. Miss Marple turned back to the room. "Thank you all for your honesty. We won't bother you further for now." Outside, the late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path as they walked back to the car. Miss Marple said quietly, "We need to speak with Alcester again. There are too many things he hasn't told us, and something." Chapter 5. The Truth in Silence. The late afternoon sun put a subdued glow over the village, and Miss Marple, Inspector Albert, and the silent youngster made their way to Allister's home, and the small girl strolled close to Miss Marple, her small hand clasped tightly in the elderly woman's gloved fingers. She had not spoken since they left Charles's family home, but something in her stillness, her unwavering grip, suggested she was listening to everything. Allister's house stood at the edge of a winding lane, a well-kept stone cottage with a garden that spoke more of practical upkeep than personal care. The hedge was clipped, but the flowers were dry, as if no one had remembered to water them. As they approached the gate, a woman stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Yes?" she questioned, looking at them curiously. Miss Marple came forward. "Good afternoon. We're come to speak with your husband." "Alcester, is he home?" "He's in the bath just now," the woman replied. "He won't be long. Do come in and wait." They entered the parlor, a neat, sparsely decorated room with mismatched cushions and the faint scent of lavender polish. The woman offered them tea, which Miss Marple declined with a gentle shake of her head. The little girl sat beside her, still clutching a corner of Miss Marple's shawl. Moments later, Alcester emerged, hair damp and shirt sleeves rolled up. He stopped in the Miss Marple responded at once, her tone calm but uncompromising. "Would you rather we speak in private, or is that all right?" "If your wife remains," Alcester glanced at his wife and then back at them, "you can say whatever you want in front of her. I have nothing to conceal." Miss Marple did not hesitate, and "We have come to find that you were associated with Mary, Charles's second wife." Alcester sighed and sat down slowly. "She was after me for quite some time. Even while Charles was alive, she would come around the property, find excuses to speak with me, linger longer than necessary." He looked down at his hands, then up again. "But after Charles died, it got worse. She started saying she didn't want to be with him anymore, that she had what she wanted, a child, and was ready to move on. She told me she'd even give me the little girl if I married." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her eyes fixed gently on him. "I told her no, because I have a wife, and I'm not the type to leave my family. But Mary didn't stop. She said she wanted the farmhouse in her name. She talked about money, land, and inheritance. And she said she'd sent a legal notice to Charles's family demanding a share of the property. "We'll be rich soon," she told me. I told her it wouldn't happen because I wasn't going to be a part of her." Inspector Albert's brows furrowed. "Did you tell anyone else about this?" "No," Alcester replied. "I didn't want trouble. I tried to keep my distance, but she kept coming back." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Alcester's wife, who had said nothing during the talk. She sat with her arms folded, face rigid with disapproval, but no surprise. "You knew?" Miss Marple questioned gently. "I knew enough," the woman responded. Stiffly, "I saw her around, saw how she looked at him, but I trust my husband. I knew he wouldn't do anything foolish." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Thank you, that will be all." For now, they stood, and Alcester followed them To the door, outside the village, was quiet, and the evening light had taken on the pale tones of early dusk, the little girl still holding. Miss Marple's hand looked up for the first time since they had arrived at the cottage. She didn't speak, but her eyes met Miss Marple's with something like pleading, something ancient and wounded in a child far too young to carry such weight. "Inspector," Albert stated, "well, he certainly gave us motive and character, but no proof." Miss Marple halted. "Not yet, but the mention of the legal notice that we can follow if Mary truly intended to claim the property. She would have needed a solicitor, and that solicitor may hold the key to her final days." Albert nodded. "I can get the list of local firms. We'll start there." They returned to the car, and as the inspector drove, Miss Marple sat quietly in the back with the little girl leaning against her side. The child had begun to soften her grip. Less rigid now, her breathing steadier. Miss Marple stroked her hair once gently, and the girl didn't flinch. "There's something we're not seeing," Miss Marple said quietly, mostly to herself. Mary was not just desperate, she was determined. A woman doesn't go to the lengths of confronting two households. Man, unless she was convinced of the outcome, she must have assumed that something or someone would safeguard her. "You think she was working with someone?" Albert inquired. "Or against someone?" Miss Marple murmured by the time they reached the village. The sun had dipped below the horizon. A cool breeze swept through the narrow lanes, carrying the scent of earth and coming rain. The mystery was deepening, and with it, the shadows around Mary's death grew longer and more complex. But Miss Marple, who had seen all manner of secrets unraveled beneath the gentlest of smiles, was patient. She knew the truth always left footprints. Even if they were faint, they would follow Mary. By the time Miss Marple, Inspector Albert, and the little girl arrived at the courthouse, the light had turned crisp and pale. There was a quiet serenity about the building, its grey stone steps flanked by rusting railings and flower beds gone untended. The girl clung to Miss Marple's hand without a sound, her steps small and hesitant, her gaze sweeping every corridor as if wary of each corner inside. Miss Marple scanned the hallway until the man looked up, blinking. "Yes, that's me. My name is Miss Marple," she said, "and this is Inspector Albert. I've come to inquire about a legal problem you may have recently handled on behalf of a woman named Mary Wentham." His expression shifted slightly, recognition, then weariness. "Yes, I did. Handle something for her, a property claim, so she instructed you to send a legal notice to Charles Wham's family asserting her right to the estate." He nodded. "That's correct. She came to me about 2 weeks before her death. She said she was married to the late Charles Went, and that she intended to make a formal claim to the farmhouse he once owned. I reviewed the marriage certificate and documentation she brought." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. "Is he here now?" "He should be," Kendall replied, standing. "He usually sorts post in the back office." They made their way through the back corridor, past the low murmur of clerks at work and the dusty scent of aged paper, until they found the man in question, Thomas Brigg. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a woolen cap tucked under his arm. He looked up as they entered. "You're Mr. Brigg?" Inspector Albert inquired. "That's me. Did you deliver a legal notice addressed to the family of Charles Went sometime in the past fortnight?" Miss Marple inquired softly but directly. Brigg nodded without hesitation. "I remember that one. Do you recall who received it?" she questioned. He wrinkled his brow for a while before nodding again. "Yes, I do. A woman answered the door, sharp as anything I'd seen in the hamlet before. She wasn't young, but neither was she elderly. She had dark hair tied up and wore a navy coat. Would you recognize her if you saw her again?" When the inspector pressed, "Oh yes," Brig responded confidently, "No doubt about it." Just then, the little girl, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, began tugging insistently on Miss Marple's hand. Not once, but several times, each time more frantically. Miss Marple knelt beside her. "What is it, dear?" The girl, her eyes wide and focused, reached into the pocket of her small woolen coat and pulled out a folded page. It was creased at the corners and slightly smudged, but she handed it to Miss Marple with purpose. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing, a child's sketch, done in crayon and pencil with uneven lines and exaggerated features, but it was detailed. It showed a house, Charles's house, and in the foreground, standing beside the gate, was a woman wearing a long coat. Albert inquired, glancing over her shoulder. Miss Marple turned to the girl. "Sweetheart, did you draw this from memory?" The child didn't say anything, but nodded firmly once. Miss Marple straightened and looked at the inspector. "We must go back to Charles's house right away." The journey back to the Wham house felt heavier than before. A creeping stillness had settled over the village, the trees lining the road bending ever so slightly in the cold breeze. By the time they reached the front gate, the sky had darkened just enough to lend an ominous quality to the place. Charles's family were all inside. Annie, Lucas, Dorothy, Amelia, and Lily gathered once more in the sitting room, anxious with the rising weight of the investigation. Miss Marple addressed them kindly but firmly. "I have a few more questions. I'm afraid." The family looked at one another, and Lucas piped out, "We've told you everything we know." "Not quite," Miss Marple responded, her voice quiet but incisive. "A legal notice was sent to this house by Mary Wham shortly before her death, and it was received here not by any man but by a woman." A ripple spread throughout the room. "We spoke with the solicitor," Miss Marple continued, "and the postman both confirmed that the notice was delivered. The postman clearly remembers a woman receiving it, a woman with dark hair and a navy coat." She turned, then unfolded the little girl's sketch and held it out. "This drawing," she said, "was done by Mary's daughter. She saw the person who answered the door that day she drew her." The room fell utterly silent. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the faces. Annie's pale and drawn, Lucas avoiding her eyes, Dorothy trembling, and finally Lily, whose eyes flickered for the briefest moment toward the drawing, then away. Inspector Albert stepped forward. "We'd like each of you to account for your whereabouts on the day the notice would have been delivered. I imagine the solicitor's log will confirm the exact date and time." Miss Marple gazed at the girl who had sat calmly on the sofa, still observing everyone. "She may not speak," Miss Marple murmured softly, "but she remembers, and she sees more than any of us realize." Chapter 7. A Child's Silent Witness. Miss Marple and Inspector Albert returned to the VOM residence on a grey afternoon, but this time, the atmosphere was markedly different. The presence of uniformed officers was enough to tip the balance of any household. But what truly shifted the air was the small, silent figure walking beside Miss Marple. The little girl's steps were light but unhesitating, and her fingers curled tightly around the elderly woman's hand. Inspector Albert moved with purpose. Flanked by reluctantly, the family gathered again. Annie sat near the fireplace in her usual upright position. Lucas and Dorothy remained by the doorway, and Amelia stood further back, arms folded. Lily quietly took a seat near the little girl, who sat close beside Miss Marple, her wide eyes watching every face in the room. Inspector Albert stood behind Miss Marple. As she began, "Mrs. Annie Wentham," she said calmly, "you told us earlier that you had no knowledge of Mary, no involvement in her affairs. And certainly no contact. That's right, Annie said firmly. But that wasn't the truth. Miss Marple's tone remained light, almost conversational. Mary sent a property claim notice through her solicitor, and that notice was delivered directly to you. Annie's lips pressed into a thin line. I've never received anything of the sort. Miss Marple gave a small nod. I thought you might say that, but we've spoken to the postman. The very one who delivered the legal documents. He remembers clearly whom he handed it to. At that moment, one of the constables stepped in, opening the front door behind him. Inspector, he said, the postman's here. Thomas Brigg entered, removing his cap respectfully. He looked around the room, scanning each face, then his eyes stopped on Annie. That's her, he said, clearly pointing. I gave the notice to that lady. She opened the gathering, plunged into a tight, startled hush. Miss Marple stepped forward and pulled out a folded sheet of paper from her handbag. She unfolded it slowly and held it up. This drawing, she said gently, was made by Mary's daughter. She doesn't speak, but she sees and remembers. In her drawing we see one woman striking another with a stick, and this woman, she paused, raising the sketch a little higher, is wearing a traditional suit and hat and has curly hair, the same as you were seen wearing the day the notice was delivered. The hush in the room grew heavier, filled not with gasps, but with the piercing calm of finality. I killed Mary. Lucas staggered backward. Mama, what are you saying? Annie raised her head slowly. Her eyes no longer burned with defensiveness. They were weary, hollow. She came to take what wasn't hers, she said. Our land, my child's land. That woman, she married him in secret, wormed her way into his life just to get her hands on this house, this name, our legacy, and then she had the audacity to send a legal claim to try and take from us. But why didn't you tell us? Dorothy asked in a whisper. I was trying to protect you all, Annie stated. I went to the guest house and was only going to confront her. But she laughed in my face and told me she'd make sure the land was hers, and that her daughter would grow up to own everything. Charles left behind. Annie's gaze flicked toward the little girl, then away again. I hated her. I hated them both. I saw a stick lying near the fireplace. I picked it up and I struck her again and again. I wanted her to be quiet. I didn't want that child to have any part of my son's name. Lucas looked horrified. You tried to harm the child. I looked for her, Annie said quietly. I did. I was in a rage, but she'd hidden somewhere later. I realized she couldn't even speak. I thought she would. Inspector Albert stood still for a long time before notifying his subordinates. Mrs. Annie Wentham, I'm arresting you for the murder of Mary Wentham. As the constables stepped forward to formally caution and escort her, the little girl edged closer to Miss Marple. Miss Marple did not look away as Annie was gently but firmly led from the room. She kept her gaze steady, not out of judgment, but out of quiet recognition for all that had been lost. Lucas sank into a chair. Dorothy wiped her eyes. Amelia, pale and shaken, moved to comfort her mother. Only Lily remained strangely composed. I always thought there was a storm in this. Inspector Albert turned towards Miss Marple. Miss Marple gazed down at the little girl who was now holding the drawing protectively to her bosom. She couldn't tell us in words, she whispered quietly, but she found a way. Albert nodded. Will you stay with her, at least for tonight? She'll stay with me, Miss Marple replied, for as long as she needs to. They stepped outside into the quiet evening. The sky had begun to clear, soft bands of orange light glowing beyond the rooftops. A breeze passed through the hedges, cool and gentle, as if the village had finally exhaled. The little girl took Miss Marple's hand again. Justice appeared too, have found its way through stillness. Epilogue, memory and reality sketched by a child's fingers. Tea letters and a tranquil future. A week had gone since the truth had come to light at the Vom house. The newspapers had published the event with a combination of reverence and calm amazement. Elderly matriarch caught in village murder. Read one headline another, had labelled it the stillness that spoke. But in St. Mary's, the pace of life remained virtually same. The grocer still opened at 7 sharp. Children still walked to school in orderly lines, and in a small ivy-framed home near the outskirts of the village, Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room pouring tea into 2 cups. One china is thin and decorated with forget-me-nots. The other is slightly sturdier and better suited to little hands. The tiny girl, Mary's daughter, sat peacefully across from her, watching the steam curl upward. She had yet to talk, but there had been changes. She now slept without anxiety, ate without urging, and had even resumed painting less frantically and less darkly. Her sketches had turned to gardens, birds, and people with smiling faces. Miss Marple had made arrangements. Of course, the child would be placed in proper care soon enough. The authorities were still tracing Mary's distant relatives, if any remained, but for the time being, she remained in the safety of the cottage, with Miss Marple reading her bedtime stories and folding her laundry into neat piles. A quiet knock came at the door. "Come in," Miss Marple shouted, "Inspector." Albert went inside, carrying his hat under one arm and a brown folder under the other. He greeted the youngster with a nod and then sat beside the hearth. "She's looking better," he noted. Miss Marple agreed, bringing him a cup of tea. "She hasn't said anything, but her eyes are softer now, less troubled." The inspector gently opened the folder, thinking he'd deliver you the final report. "It's all official now. Annie Wyndham's confession confirms the forensics. The blood on the stick, the blunt force wounds all align, so there's little doubt she killed Mary." Miss Marple nodded gravely, and the girl, "No further threats," he said. "She be placed with a family in the county, one with experience in emotional care, though I must say, I think she's grown rather attached to you, Miss." Marple smiled, the faintest trace of emotion flickering behind her usual composure. "We found a rhythm, she and I. There's something to be said for quiet companionship." Albert sipped his tea, then leaned back. "You know the drawing she made, the one that broke the case? Wide open. It's going to be used in training. They want to teach detectives to look beyond words, to listen with more than their ears." Miss Marple's expression warmed. "A child's truth is often clearer than an adult's reason. It only needed someone to see it." They sat in silence for a moment. The clock ticked softly outside. A robin sang somewhere near the hedge. Albert cleared his throat. "There's still something that bothers me." "Oh," he looked over at the child. "What if she hadn't drawn it? What if we'd never known?" Miss Marple's gaze moved to the sketch pinned to the sideboard. A simple crayon drawing of a cottage and garden, and 2 women seated on a bench with a teacup between them. "Then the truth would still be there," she said softly, waiting. "That's the nature of it. Truth does not disappear. It waits for someone to notice." Albert stood wiping the crumbs from his jacket. "You'll let me know if you need anything," she responded. After he departed, Miss Marple returned to the tea tray and refilled the child's cup. The girl took it without saying anything and sipped silently, her gaze fixed on the window, where the late afternoon sun spilled across the garden path. Miss Marple followed her gaze. There were tulips sprouting beneath the fence, and a small robin pecking at breadcrumbs on the stone ledge. The world appeared to have already begun to heal. She looked down at the girl and gently placed a hand over hers. "We'll go for a walk soon," she said. "There's a lovely tree at the edge of the wood, perfect for sitting under." The girl did not speak, but she grinned.